Hello, mind mappers, and welcome to our first video inside of the mind mapping course. Inside of this video, I'm going to share with you a little bit about my story, how I came to discover mind mapping, why mind mapping has played such an important role in my life and my learning process, and I hope that by sharing this with you, that you'll be able to make some connections to your life and why mind mapping might be able to help and how mind mapping could be important as a transformational tool that you could learn to use in your own life. Now, when I first started growing up, I had trouble learning in school. During my school years, I definitely wasn't the best student, definitely not by a long shot. School was so boring for me. Nothing we were doing seemed to have any relation to the real world. I still believe that to this day. If a piece of information doesn't connect directly to the real world, I have a hard time remembering it and seeing why it might be important. Simply consuming information because I might need it later didn't and doesn't seem to make very much sense to me. The subjects didn't seem to stimulate me creatively either. Now, this is true to this day as well. I really get on a kick. For example, right now I'm really on a kick of Stoicism because some of the things that they teach inside of their philosophies are just so creatively stimulating for me. And that's essentially how I choose some of my books. I get stimulated creatively or professionally or productively by a certain piece of information, a certain type of information, a certain line of thinking, and I really just follow that along, and that's how I decide to learn nowadays. I looked down on myself for years because I had this problem of not being able to focus. I know now it's because my brain doesn't work linearly, which is something, which is actually what memorization and writing on paper is all about, is linear thinking. It's reading a book and remembering that exact passage. Instead, my brain, and I suspect your brain, is a creative, big picture, and connection focused machine. And I expect, again, if you're here, those are the things that you like to spend your most time thinking about. You like to be creative, you like to think about the big picture, and you like to make connections for things that seem to be seemingly unconnected. And the good news is that I've figured out a way to harness that power instead of feeling bad about it and instead of struggling continually against what is actually a superpower. Now, after I had trouble learning in school, I actually decided to start reading a book a week, and that's what you guys are seeing the fruits of right now on the YouTube channel. Is I read about a book a week or so. After college, this is when I decided to take up that challenge of reading a book a week. Everything from personal development to productivity to spirituality. Funny story, I've read books about building cob houses or building ecologically friendly houses. I've read books on dog training. I've read books on horse training. I've really read a wide variety of different books. The books that you guys see are the personal development, productivity, and spirituality books because that's what's appealing to people on YouTube. And that's the ones that I read and do mind maps on. These books all made a really big impact on me. And again, I just followed my passion. I followed my creativity. Eventually, I saw a pattern in almost every different version of the books that I read, in every different version of the personal development, productivity, and spirituality books that I read, and also in the dog training, horse training, and even the building ones as well. Most of these books ended up teaching very similar concepts. The books quite often caused me to make short-term and radical shifts into my daily life. For example, when I first read Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, when it first came out, I shut down all of the apps on my phone, I deleted all my social media profiles, and that shift ended up being pretty short-lived. It caused quite a lot of anxiety and distrust in myself because I was constantly trying to look for the next big thing, the next thing that was going to make me better, the next thing that was going to make me happier. And that's how I was starting all these personal development and productivity books. I had that mindset when I was in this really kind of heavy reading period. So, what was really gained from the book a week journey? First, I realized that it wasn't my inability to learn that was the problem, but it was that I didn't have a strong enough why. I wasn't able to follow my passion. I wasn't able to follow my creativity and let that guide me into what types of books and learning I wanted to consume. Second, it was just a realization that no information is really new. Most of it had been articulated, and the real principles are an important part of learning. So, what are the through lines in all of your favorite books, your teachings, and your philosophies that you can apply those principles to every aspect of your life? Instead of trying to make these radical shifts for a new habit or a new mode of working or a new productivity hack that you can try, let's dive deep into the principles of what each one of these books is trying to get at. That's what I'm trying to do in all of my mind maps. The third thing that I realized was that I was trying to take any information as gospel and apply it consciously, as in uh, turning off all the apps on my phone or doing a new productivity hack or any of the things that I learned in the book. They're not wrong necessarily, but me taking it as gospel and applying it to my life, it really makes learning and life a lot less enjoyable. Simply because when I try and really apply something to my life that doesn't fit me in particular, quite often, like we talked about before, you end up burning out pretty quickly, or at least I do. Fourth was the understanding that almost all of the information really is just principle based. It's not strategy based, it's not tactic based, it's not the checklists or the how to's that really matter. It's the deep meaning and the principles that are the real knowledge. And that's coming from understanding how to apply the principles that are in all of these books as the through line. Those are the ones that you want to be able to apply to your life because you can apply it to every different area. For example, a lot of the teachings from Stoicism are so applicable to today's day and age, not because they had really good tips and tricks of how to be productive or wake up early or be more mentally strong, but the processes, the principles that they share have stood the test of time because they still matter today. They figured something out that was innate in human beings, and they shared it with us, and now we can apply that to different areas of our lives. Therefore, I realized that the process of learning really isn't linear. It's not the more information you know, the better off you are, as I once thought. I was kind of accumulating all of these different books and all of that different knowledge for no real reason. Instead, really, what it is a process of training your mind, picking up principles along the way, but you want to train your mind, number one, what information is important to me and why? How can I choose the right information given what is important to me? Number two, these are really the four principles of mind mapping as I see it, by the way. What are the fundamental principles behind this information? Not what are the tactics, not what are the strategies, not what are the how-tos, but what are the principles that underline this piece of information that I'm reading? And then how can I already see that information at play in my life, negatively or positively? Am I succumbing to distraction quite a lot? Why might that be? What's the principle behind why I'm being distracted? Am I being insanely productive in one area of my life, in my side project? What are some of the principles behind that? Is it because I'm getting into flow state more often? Is it because I'm focusing better when I don't have a ton of pressure on myself? Those underlying principles that you can find in some of the ancient teachings and also echoed in some of the new productivity books and personal development books that are out there, that's what we need to look at. And we want to see how that information is already at play in our life right now so we can make an informed decision, a rational decision about whether we want to make a change or not to that particular thing. And finally, we want to use your innate creativity to apply the information to all other areas of your life. Don't just learn a principle and put it into play at work, for example, or don't just learn a principle and put it into play into your business. How can we take this and put it into play in other people's businesses, in other businesses that you might start? How can we put it into play in your personal life? That's very, very important with information, and it makes the information that you get exponentially more valuable. You could read one book, but apply that book to several different areas of your life and get the same benefit or more than you would if you read several different books about several different areas in your life. So after the book a week and after my trouble learning in school, eventually I found mind mapping. I was searching for answers to these problems that I had with learning and personal development. I realized that linearly reading books was just not helping me. I wasn't able to kind of use those fundamental four principles that I had realized were so important. At first, I thought it would be a good way to memorize information when I came across mind mapping. It definitely is that. But then I realized again that the problem was not that I couldn't memorize things, it was how to get the information in front of me to have a lasting impact on my life, which of course is what we all want. It's a funny thing, memorization. It doesn't work the way that you think it would. It is great for recalling on tests or for looking smart in front of your friends, but what else is it really good for? I mean, just because you've memorized something doesn't mean you're going to be able to implement it, doesn't mean you're going to be able to apply it to one area in your life, let alone the several dimensions that we've already been talking about. You're not going to be able to be aware of that piece of information in your daily life just because you've memorized it, or you're not going to be able to help someone else with it, which for me is also very important. So again, when I came across this stumbling block, even though I was using mind mapping at the time, I realized that I was really looking for a learning system, ones that would help me apply information to my life. Through different books, teachings, and courses, I found out about the format method of learning that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the course. This method has solved all of my problems with traditional learning. I was able to not only choose books, courses, or articles that had a strong why for me, something that I felt drawn to, something that had a reason for me to be consuming this information. From there, I was able to capture all the relevant information quickly and identify patterns between different teachings. Those are the principles that we talked about before. After the information was down, format allows you to think fully through the information and identify how that information and those principles might already be impacting you and might impact you in the future. Finally, format encourages us to think about how this information might be at play in other areas of our life. It might be in other business ideas, in other businesses, in other areas of our life, from relationship to business to career to our relationship with ourselves. And the other part of the final piece of format is it really allows us to know how it might help our fellow man, which is very important for me because I believe that's a style of learning that a lot of people have out there. Is that how can I transform these principles, these teachings, these pieces of information that I picked up along the way and make it not only legible to other people, but applicable to other people. So now I've found it. I found this learning system that's going to work in the real world. And it just so happens that this learning system is a non-linear way of thinking, and it fits perfectly with mind mapping, a non-linear way of taking notes, of thinking, of meditating on a piece of information. And that's what we're going to be learning in this course. The next module, we're going to be talking about how mind mapping is going to help, and then we'll talk about the course layout. After that, we're going to get into the technical aspects of mind mapping and then move on to principles and exercises. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Welcome to the second module inside of our introduction to mind mapping. Now, inside of this module, we're going to be talking about how mind mapping can help. Some of the specific ways that I believe mind mapping can be used to not only learn more and remember better, but also be used in many other scenarios as well. Now, some of the main benefits of mind mapping over top of some of the more traditional forms of note taking is that you really have full creative control. Mind maps allow you to have as much creative control or as little creative control as you desire for any different project that you have going on, including if you're trying to learn from personal development books. The mind doesn't remember words in a string nearly as much as it remembers things like colors, sequences, and pictures. Mind maps can adapt to any possible thought framework. For example, if you don't like the format model that I've presented here today, you can change it up. There are literally hundreds of thought models out there, thinking models out there that you can use mind mapping to model. It's very interesting when you combine the tool of mind mapping with some of the tools of learning that are available nowadays. The other important thing about how mind mapping helps is it gives you a sense of information hierarchy. So mind maps are structured really in the same way that the mind stores information in an information hierarchy. The mind uses its neurons to link one piece of information to another in a sequential manner. Information hierarchy is essentially linking the most important, which is essentially the book that we're going over, and then it leads to the biggest piece of information, and then the smaller pieces come afterwards. And each piece connects to the higher piece up on the totem pole. And really, you can use this in an infinite matter. And this is one of the reasons that I think mind mapping is so much better for creative brainstorming, for learning, for remembering things better, is because it mimics the way that our minds are built. If you know anything about the anatomy of the mind, a mind map essentially follows the same structure as our neurons do. Mind mapping also allows us to have better memory. One study shows that mind maps allow participants to remember up to 32% more information. This is because, again, mind maps are mimicking the way that our brains are working. It doesn't cause this friction that writing down notes on a piece of paper might. Plus, it allows us to use more sensory input, which, if you've studied any sort of learning philosophy, is very, very important. The more places, the more structures, the more sensory input that you can use when taking notes, the better your memory will be. There are many different learning styles that mind map allow us to identify our own way of learning and adapt to it as opposed to adapting our learning to the medium. So when you're writing notes, you really only have one kind of sequential note-taking manner. You could have the headline of what you're taking notes on and subheadlines, and then it could go kind of straight into bullet points. You could write out full page notes. There are a few different ways that you could do it, but mind mapping literally has infinite possibilities. Do you learn better in a more sequential manner? Well, then that's great. You should really utilize information hierarchy. Do you think more in terms of creative, or do you think more non-linearly? Well, that's great. Mind mapping is good for moving around the different pieces of information so that you can structure it in a way that'll help you remember. You see, mind mapping is really one of the best ways to improve your memory of any piece of information. Another piece of mind mapping that I think is really, really important is the fact that you can go from abstract to granular with no friction. So mind maps allow us to look at the big picture, which would be abstract, and the finer details, which would be granular. This allows us to come up with some creative solutions to problems, and also by seeing the big picture, we can link things between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. At the same time that we can see really granular pieces of information pulled directly from the books, which may be quotes, which may be specific exercises, we can see the full map expand and really improve our memory and creativity by looking at the abstract version of the map. Now, we can really dive deep into the granular part of it where we go over the specific quotes and the how-tos, but with abstraction, we can remember the full map. We can remember every piece of information rather than memorizing lines on a page as writing down notes tends to want us to do. The other part that I really like is learning models. And this is something that I learned while I was learning about mind mapping. At first, I was mind mapping following the same models that I was taught in the mind mapping books. Namely, I would put pieces of information on all four corners of the page. I would do a bunch of colors. I would try to do as little words as possible. Something like someone like Tony Buzan, the founder of mind mapping, would want us to do. But then I stumbled into learning models, and I really think that learning models take mind mapping to another level. The learning model that we're going to present here will force you to think all the way around the information. When you're normally note taking, you're not forced to think around a piece of information. You're forced to write it down on a piece of paper in hopes that you're going to remember it at a later date, which isn't all that helpful unless you're studying for a specific fill in the blank test. By hitting all four learning styles, we're not only going to help you remember, but we're also going to help you integrate the information, which is the name of the game in personal development. Mind mapping lends itself very well to developing different thought models for learning, planning, and creativity. More on the second two to come. Now, what I think is that the format model is the best one that I've found for learning, but I also have really good models for planning and creativity, and one of them is brainstorming. So, this is one of the most important skills in today's market. If you're in the career market, if you're in the job market, if you're an entrepreneur, brainstorming and coming up with creative ideas is maybe the most important piece of your job. Coming up with creative solutions to problems is very valuable, and mind maps, to me, is a really great tool to help with that. You'll really wow your boss and your colleagues if you have a good understanding of how mind maps work. Because of the hierarchical structure and ability to see the abstract and granular points of each of the part of the map, it really gives us the ability to make connections. And that's really what creativity is all about. So when I'm brainstorming, I'm a really big fan of grabbing and moving around the different modules that I've been learning. If I've been taking notes, I really like to restructure the book in a way that makes more sense to me. Now, this isn't for everyone, but brainstorming is a very powerful tool. And quite often, writing notes down on a piece of paper just doesn't fit the bill. Mind mapping gives us the ability to think non-linearly and allows us to see the abstract and granular. It also gives us that full creative control that an open and blank piece of paper might, while also allowing us to be structured about our thinking through learning models. These are some of the ways that mind mapping is going to help you learn more and remember better. Next, we're going to move on to the course layout, and then finally, we'll get into the technical aspects of mind mapping. I look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to our third module in the introduction. This one's going to be going over the course layout, or what you can expect from this course. Essentially, this course is broken down into a couple of different points. After this introduction, we'll speak about the more technical aspects of mind mapping. We're going to talk about how to use XMind, the technology behind the mind mapping software that I use. We're going to talk a little bit about the terminology that we tend to use when mind mapping, which can be very important if you're presenting to someone else. And we're also going to talk about how to structure your mind maps using the format learning model, the learning model that I'm going to put forward to help you learn more and remember better. After we get through our technical introduction, we're going to talk more about the principles of mind mapping. Now, the principles of our mind mapping process will give an understanding of my process without sticking you into a specific mold. I don't want to show you my mind mapping process and leave you to fend for yourself. Instead, what I want to show you how to do is what my mind mapping process is and also how I came up with it. Not just the tactics, but the principles behind my specific mind mapping process. Inside of this module, we're going to talk about the 80-20 principle of information and how mind mapping can be used to really 80-20 the information to make your time spent learning shorter, but your retention ability will be higher. How to focus for long periods of time on learning. Probably the number one most important point for learning anything is being able to focus for a long period of time. And it's getting harder and harder nowadays as our attention spans are kind of correlatingly getting lower and lower. I'm going to show you how to hack that and make sure that you can spend a long period of time focused deep in learning. I'm also going to show you about the format learning model for mind mapping success. We've already talked quite at length about the format learning model. I think a lot of you are going to enjoy it, and you're going to be able to use it in many different areas of your life, even outside of mind mapping. The final point, we're going to talk about how presenting, even if it's just to yourself, is going to help you learn. Be more creative and implement the information into your life. I'm a big believer in presenting the information that we learn, not only because it's going to help us learn more and remember better, but also because it's going to help us be more creative and actually look for ways to implement the information into our lives. The final module that we're going to be going over in exercises will give you 3 different mind map templates to test out on your own. First, I'll go through them and explain my process, and after that, I'm going to set you free and let you mind map in the wild. This final module I think might be the most important for a lot of you because it's going to take all of the principles and all of the technology and really show you step by step how to use it. I've highlighted different areas of my previous mind maps to show you how I've been using the learning model in each and every one of my videos. I look forward to seeing you in our first introduction to technical aspects of mind mapping, where I'm going to show you exactly how I set up my mind maps for success. Hello and welcome to the first module of our technical introduction to mind mapping. Today I'm going to show you the software that I use to mind map, It's simply called XMind. And if you go to xmind.net, you can download a free version of the software to your computer. Now, the version that I use is actually the paid version, and that's what allows me to use the different photos that I use and a couple of other similar features to the mind mapping software. However, I don't believe that to get the full benefit of mind mapping, you need to download this software. Quite simply, if I wasn't presenting the mind maps to people on my YouTube channel, I probably would not have the full software. I would probably continue to use the free download. With that being said, if you download XMind onto your computer at xmind.net, you can download it completely for free and you will be able to have an app on your computer, which will look something similar to this, XMind Zen. And what I do when I'm going to set up my mind map from scratch is essentially scroll over my mind map. I'll click on my mind map, XMind Zen, the first time. The map that I always tend to choose is the official mind map. Now you could also choose any one of these different colored mind maps, different structures, and etc. But for the purposes of our video, I'm going to show you exactly how I set up the mind maps for the YouTube channel. So I double click on the official template and I do a couple of quick things before I even get started. I scroll over here to the formatting tool, and what I'll do is I'll change up the structure. Currently you can see that I have a four-way structure, and I found for mind mapping specific information the four-way structure is not what I want to use. Quite simply, I want my information to be more linear and have a hierarchical structure that we talked about before. So I click on the structure point and it will open up the different structures that we can choose. So you can see there's a lot of different structures here. You can choose any one that you like. I personally like to choose directly to the right. Now you can see that all of my nodes will continue to line to the right. And that's what I like when I'm mind mapping books, again, because it's more linear and has a more hierarchical structure. For different types of maps, including creativity and brainstorming, I might use a different structure. It really just depends on the task at hand. A couple of other things that I like to do with my mind mapping, and it will be a good way to show you how to control the mind mapping software, is I like to always turn on tapered lines. I just believe that it leads my eye to the piece of information a little bit nicer and it looks a little better. So that's why I choose to do that. I also choose to drag in a photo every single time I start a mind map. So you can see I'll drag a photo into the mind mapping software here and it will line up with my first node. I'll take away the fill and I'll get rid of the name of the photo. And then what I like to do is I like to color my mind map around the book that I'm doing. Now, the reason that I do that is because I believe that color is one of the most linking factors that our minds use. After all, we used to be cave people and the color of the berries used to really matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on a white background so that our nice yellow book is going to stand out very well. After that, I'm going to click on our first node here, and I'll use the color picker tool to choose the same yellow that's in my mind mapping book. Now you can see that my text is obviously a white and it doesn't quite show up very well on the yellow. So quite simply, I'll come over here to the text picker and I will choose dark black. That's going to show up a little bit better against the yellow background. And then what I'll do is copy that same exact sequence for each of the child nodes. Now these child nodes can also be selected by hitting Shift and clicking on each of the child nodes. You can change the same color all at once. Once again, I'll just click the color picker tool. I'll scroll over to this little color dropper and I will click on the yellow node. Once again, I'll need to also change my text color, and that happens by clicking on the black right here. Now you can see how I have my mind map set up initially, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to name the specific mind map first. So all you have to do to actually input the text is double click. You can hit the backspace as you normally would on your keyboard, and you can type whatever you want, but I usually type the name of the book that I'm mind mapping. You can see that it'll automatically format, and after that what I might do is click on the first node and name it Introduction, as I do in each of my mind maps. The introduction is going to serve as a really great way for us to go over the entire reason for the mind map. With that, we'll talk a little bit more about the formula that I use to create these mind maps a little bit later. We're going to continue on with a little bit more of the specifics around the technical aspects of mind mapping to help you hopefully get you moving smoothly through the mind mapping process. Now, if I want to create another child node, so these are the bigger child nodes and the colored child nodes, what I would do is I would click, and you can see that it kind of highlights. I would hit Command or Control C, and that's going to copy the node for me. And what I'm going to be able to do is click on the main node again, and I'll Control V or Control Paste, and that'll allow me to create as many different nodes as I might want. Now you can see that while I was doing that, that what actually happened was if I had the first node highlighted, the smaller node highlighted, it would actually control paste on a node after that. And that's one of the tools that I use when I'm actually taking text from a document. So what I'll usually do when I'm reading the book is I'll type into a Word document or a Google document the quote from the book that I want to pull out. And what I'll do is I'll go over to my Word document. I don't have it set up right now, but I'll control and paste the actual quote from the book right here into the mind map. After that, what I would do is I would come back to the introduction, I would hit the tab, and I would type in anything that I want after that. You can see that quite simply I can hit the tab and it'll create a new subtopic each and every time. If I want to create a subtopic underneath that subtopic but keep it at the same level, I would hit the enter button and it would create a second subtopic. Now if I wanted to get rid of each and every one of these subtopics, I could simply hit the backspace or delete button and it would delete all of the nodes as well. Another thing that took me a little while to learn with the mind mapping software is that let's say I have multiple different topics and I want to change the actual place that the topics are at, you can simply just click on it and drag up and down to put it in a different place. Now there are for sure a lot of different things going on in the technical aspects of mind mapping and XMind in particular, but these are the main ones that I use to create my mind maps. Now what I would do if I'm finished with my mind map is I would quite simply click the X button up in the corner and I would save my changes. Make sure that you save your changes because this is not an online software. It is an offline software that requires you to save your changes before you close the application. As you can see, it has a handy way of asking you to save your changes if you haven't finished saving already. And with that, we're going to move into the more technical or the more theory aspects of mind mapping, where we're going to talk more about the specific words that we use in mind mapping. We're going to talk more about the theory behind mind mapping itself, and I'll see you there. Welcome back to our second unit inside of the technical aspects of mind mapping. Before this, we talked about the XMind technicals or the software technicals. Now we're going to talk about the mind mapping technical, or a little bit about the technical aspects of mind mapping. We're going to talk about the structure, the information hierarchy, and how I process information to make sure that the mind maps are well structured and easy to follow for everyone doing the videos and for myself. First, let's get into the structure. There's three main points in any mind map. The first one is the main topic. This really is the reason for the mind map. So it could be the reason of this course, it could be the book title, it could be the presentation title, or just the topic title in general. You want to make it as clear and easy to understand as possible, and I'm pretty partial to making it so that I can have one of the images that will help remind me exactly what the topic is, and then I color the map to match that image. I'm pretty partial to that because I believe that my brain, and probably yours as well, does a much better job at remembering colors and patterns than it does at remembering specific topics and words. Right after that, we're going to talk about the parent nodes, which is the second most important part of mind mapping. It basically breaks down the information into subtopics. The parent nodes would be these yellow topics that you're seeing right here that basically denote what the entire mind map piece is going to be about. These subtopics all relate again to the main topic, but they don't necessarily relate exactly to each other. Other than that, they have a relationship to the main topic. They have a relationship to the book. These are the colored nodes again in my mind maps, and generally I try to make them short and easy to remember. You can see that this mind map is all one word parent nodes. Some of the mind maps that I do on my YouTube channel include one word parent nodes, or sometimes it's a short phrase Quite often I'll try and make it funny or something that will stand out a little bit more than just a single word. But for this one, I think it was very good to keep it nice and compact, name the lessons exactly what they were going to be. This is really up to you, but something that sticks out in your mind is going to be the best. You want to make sure that it's maybe just a maximum of 3 to 5 words. After that, we're going to talk about the child nodes, which is essentially each and every node that goes on after the parent node. This is where all of the real information is stored. The eldest child node is where I would copy my information from the piece of content that I'm mind mapping. So the child nodes essentially go in chronological age order, is the way that I think about it. So the eldest is going to be the one that's the closest to the parent node. After that, you're going to have child nodes that are even a little bit younger and a little bit younger, but this one would be the eldest. This would be the more senior one, the more important one. And each one of these ones are obviously siblings. If they're on the same exact level, they're called sibling nodes. Not that you maybe need to know that, but that's what they're called in mind mapping. Below that is where I'm going to implement my format thinking process and expand on the information. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next lessons, but the format thinking model all kind of relates to the way that I'm structuring the mind map. So essentially what we're doing is we're getting the eldest node. That's going to be our copy and paste from the book. That's going to be our direct quote from the author. And then underneath that, we're going to start and create more child nodes that are going to expand upon the information using that format thinking model that we'll talk about a little bit later. Information hierarchy, one of the main things that go on inside of mind mapping. So the biggest concepts happen first. The biggest and most important concepts would be these parent nodes. Sub-concepts happen later. Generally, they are in chronological order from the piece of information. So for me, usually what I do is I start with the biggest and most important, which is always the introduction. And then after that, you can do one of two things. You can come into the mind map and do a chronological order of the book, or sometimes you can rearrange these sub-concepts, which are right here, based on the way that makes more sense for you. Could make the most sense if you're reading a book is usually chronological order, but sometimes if you're taking in a full course or a piece of information, it makes sense to move these nodes around, these sub-concepts around. The information is what I put into the mind map. It's directly highlighted and taken specifically from the subject matter. Now, inside of a Kindle, you can't directly copy and paste, so I tend to highlight and type in. But it really just depends on the type of information you're taking in. If you're just doing an article, you could easily copy and paste into the mind map, as I showed you in the technical aspects. So you don't want to rethink or paraphrase my own version of this information because it ends up being biased. Now, this is just what I do for my videos, and as you can see in this mind map, there is actually no copy and pasted information, so I did have to kind of create it all myself. But generally what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of highlight the pieces of information that I think are the most important, and I'm going to directly copy that into the mind map, and then I'll shut the book and I'll only use the pieces of information that I pulled out, and I wouldn't go kind of back and forth to the book quite so much. I don't want to paraphrase the information in the book because I want it to be pulled directly out of it. The thought model and the structure that I go through is always the same. It's always the format model. Every video you'll watch, you'll see that I use the format model to structure my thinking. Sometimes I will expand more on one type of learning than the other. Now, the format learning model that we'll talk about a little bit later is really playing at the 4 different aspects of learning. We're talking about the what of learning, or the technical information. We're talking about why the information is important. We're talking about how we can use the information in our lives, and where else the information might be useful. Generally, people I teach this method find that they have one favorite type. Maybe you have a very strong slant towards the technical part of it. Maybe you're more interested in how you can use it in your everyday life. You can use all of them, but probably what's going to happen is you're going to learn that you more connect with one specific point in the format model, and it's okay. You can use that point more than you use the other ones. You can expand upon that point more than you do the other points. That's a good way to go about it. Still is important to think all the way around the problem and use each of the different models to help you with memory and to help you with creative thinking. Next, we'll talk about processing information, or how I process information to put it into the mind map. So the first part of processing information is obviously intaking the information. First, you have to read, watch, or listen to the information. And as I do that, I want to think about what the structure of my mind map might be. What are kind of the main notes that the book's hitting, or the article's hitting, or the podcast is hitting, and how might I structure that into a mind map? And I do that all in my own mind. I think about what the main topic of the information is. If it's a book, it's quite easy. I think about what the subtopics might be and how they would be structured. How would I lay them out? What order would I like to put these subtopics into? While taking in the information, I'll physically highlight or I'll write down points if I'm listening to something, and I'll put in the information directly into the map, kind of as I'm going. This is a very important point because it actually forces me to be very particular about the information that I highlight. Quite often, when I was first starting on mind mapping, I would find myself highlighting entire passages of a book, and that just simply doesn't fit. We need to make sure that we are 80/20ing the information, something we'll talk about a little bit later, but we need to make sure that we're only highlighting the important information, or else we have to filter the information more than once, which can end up being pretty cumbersome. It doesn't aid in the learning process quite so much. Simply because I don't want the mind map to have I only want to have a mind map that has 16 to 13 nodes. Can you imagine if I had this course and it had 25, 40, 50 nodes? That is all it takes is 40 or 50 different highlights in a book for that to happen pretty quickly. So you want to be very, very selective about the information. Personal preference for me, but I've noticed that anything after 10 plus nodes really starts to become more of an exercise in note taking rather than an exercise in thinking. Now, obviously, this is going to depend quite heavily on your knowledge of the topic, and it probably will also depend on the topic itself, how much information there is, how long the book is, and etc. Next, we'll talk about inputting information. The first thing I do when inputting the information is I create a structure. I name the main topic and I put the subtopics in. Second, I'll go and I'll copy the information highlighted into the mind map. And I structure it so that it's not just a giant wall of text. You'll notice inside of my mind maps, I make sure to break up the quotes similar to the way that the paragraphs would be broken up so that it's not a giant wall of text, because it's harder to take in that way. I generally like to have 1 to 2 sentences in each of the nodes, and if I go all the way up to a full paragraph, I can find myself not taking in the information quite so well. After I'm done copying and pasting into the mind map, I move directly into the thought model, and that's what we're going to talk about next. This is by far the most important part of the process. The reading, the copying, those are both pretty good for helping your memory, but really what we want to do is think all the way around the problem. For many different reasons that we've already discussed, this is going to help us remember better, and it's going to help us learn more and come up with more creative ideas. So after all the information is put into the mind map, I turn on the Zen mode and I think all the way through each of the subtopics, not going back to the books and etc. If you need to know how to turn on the Zen mode, it's up in the top right-hand corner of the XMind technical part of XMind, and you can get into a mode similar to this where you can't see anything else on your screen. I do this by using the format learning model, again, that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the principles. The first draft of each mind map is usually just a good starting off point. I'll let those ideas mature in my mind for as long as I can, and then I'll revisit the mind map and rethink and edit the thought model part of it. Now, obviously, I won't edit the actual parts that I pulled out of the book or out of the podcast or the video, but what I will do is rethink my thoughts. I'll rethink the why, I'll rethink the what, I'll rethink the how, I'll rethink the different areas that the piece of information could be used in, and that's a really great way to help remember more, but also learn more from the situation. One piece of information is worth a heck of a lot more if you rethink your way around the thought model multiple times rather than just letting it sit in your mind and gathering dust. This gives me a chance to change my mind over the weeks and my perspectives I've gained over the hours, days, or weeks that I let these ideas mature in my subconscious mind. So quite often I'll be working on more than one mind map at a time. Quite often I'll be reading 2 or 3 books all at once. one piece of information from one mind map connects with another piece of information in another mind map, and I decide to change the way that I've thought about that piece of information. This is happening all the time with the different Stoic books that I'm reading right now, because the Stoics had so many great and interesting points that are actually very useful in today's day and age. I'm finding myself finding many different areas that they could be applied, and I'm having quite a lot of fun with that, and I know you will too. Keep the mind maps in mind as you go about your daily life. If you go for walks or if you have thinking time built into your day, quite often you'll find yourself coming up with new and exciting ideas from the same information you put in the mind map the day before. Welcome to our first unit inside of the principles of mind mapping. We're going to be going over the 80-20 principle and how it applies to mind mapping. Now, a lot of you probably already know about the 80-20 principle, but for those of you that don't, let's start off with what the 80-20 principle actually is. The 80-20 principle states that 80% of your results will come from 20% of your efforts. This means that if you read 100 pages of something, 20 of those pages will have 80% of the information. So how can we use this principle to your advantage, to our advantage? Well, by understanding and adhering to the 80-20 principle, we can make better choices. When we know what we want to learn, we can better choose the places that we might learn it from. This basically says don't pick up a textbook if a book would do, and don't pick up a book if an article might do. This also means that you can choose mediums that work best for you. 20% of the mediums that are out there are going to work better for you than the 80% that are available. If you find you can learn more effectively and more efficiently from interviews than books, then use those, or perhaps it's vice versa. I just tend to learn the best from books, so that's what I use. The 80-20 principle gives you permission to ruthlessly decide the type of information that you choose to read. Now, put this into perspective. You only have so much time to read, and you only have so much time on this planet. You need to make sure that you are being ruthless with the information that you are deciding to consume, because there's only a certain amount of time in the day to learn. And if we're wanting to learn the maximum amount possible, we need to really make sure that we're choosing only the 20% and we're not spending our time in the 80%. This is a real mindset shift for most people. Most people I know are reading one book cover to cover. And I hate to break it to you, but that's not how I do it on the YouTube channel. I start out with what I know I want to learn, and I only read the 20% of the book that I believe will get me the closest to that possible answer. Now, if you've listened to my mind mapping books, you might not have even noticed that, because what I've gotten really, really good at over the years is deciding that 20%, deciding what 20% of that book is going to be impactful to the reader, and only reading and only mind mapping that piece. It's really a process, so you're going to have to learn that for yourself. When we know what we want to learn, we can better choose also what we can pay attention to. Now that we've decided what to learn from, we should also be aware that the 80-20 principle applies to that information as well. I talked about this a little bit already, but here we go. Let's go a little bit deeper. What's 20% of 20%? If my math is correct, which I think it is, that's 4%. So 4% of a book is really going to get you about 70% of the information. Now, this is very, very important, because if you're going to read very quickly, you need to be able to find that information and identify it. The first step in that process is to understand the 80-20 principle and strictly adhere to it, so you can learn how to find the right information. Let's talk about 80-20 of material. So first off, we're talking about the types of information available. We've got book summaries, we've got articles, we've got books, we've got interviews, we've got presentations. Heck, you could even use my own YouTube videos, and you could 80-20 my YouTube videos. That might be a very good exercise for some of you. What 20% of my videos were effective for you and were meaningful for you, and which 80% were not? I'd love to hear some of that for you, and I'd love to see some of your mind maps if you decide to go about that. You can also use different types of information when you just need to know around a topic. You don't need to necessarily know a deep dive into a topic or a concept. Maybe it's better to listen to an interview of the author talking about the main points from the book than it is to read the entire book itself. Quite often, what I'll do before I read a book is actually listen to the interview. And if I listen to the interview and the book is intriguing and I think there might be some more points to gain from it, that's when I'll go into the book. Essentially, what I'm saying here is start to be more selective about the information that you decide to read or take in, because it really is important to make sure that you are not spending your time on the 80% of the information that's going to get you 20% of the results that you want or help you learn 20% of the important pieces of information. So, how do we go about deciding what to read? Well, what outcome do you want? Do you want a general knowledge? Summaries are going to be great for that. Articles are going to be great if you're developing a presentation. You could kind of put together multiple articles in that case for a presentation. Books are going to be great if you want a deeper knowledge of the information. If you've maybe already gone through the summary, you've gone through the interview, they're going to be very, very good for deciding whether you want to know a little bit more about the information and not just the action points, which is what interviews would be able to get you. So, what if you learn better from a particular medium? Most people would say that you have to read the book or you have to watch this documentary on a particular topic. I tend to believe that people actually learn better from certain mediums. It's totally understandable as we all have different learning styles, and each learning medium might cater to a different learning style. A video might cater to one person's learning style more than a book does. So, if this is you, please disregard all of the information above. You're best to learn from the medium that you prefer. If you prefer podcasts, prefer interviews, make sure that you're learning from those. If you prefer books or you prefer articles, make sure that you're paying attention to those. Don't try and force yourself to read if you're better at listening, or listen if you're a better reader. This is not the time and place for that. School used to force us to adhere to a specific medium, and no longer do we have to do this. I recommend that you experiment and pay attention to the 80/20 principle. Can I get more information from an interview or from a book or from an article or vice versa? I recommend that you start to pay attention to the material that you're taking in and strictly adhere to the 80/20 principle. Only take in that 20% of material and only in the medium that works the best for you. Let's talk about the 80/20 part of the process. So the process of 80/20 is when you're taking in new information can be really hard to learn. I didn't really understand it in the very beginning. It's hard to understand in the very beginning. It's really kind of an act of faith in the very beginning. When you're only reading 20% of a book, you can definitely feel like you're going to miss out on something. When you're listening on 2 times speed and only slowing down at certain points, it can feel like you're kind of wasting your time. But here's why it's worth it. There's only so much attention available. Wouldn't you rather learn how to spot useful information and use your attention on it? And that's really breaking down that learning the 80/20 principle in learning is a skill. And if you plan to learn for a lifetime, this is going to be the most valuable skill. You literally are going to 5x your return on investment if you learn this skill when it comes to reading and learning. Rather than treating all information the same and burning your attention out on things that might not matter. That's very important. Like I said, you're going to be able to get 5 times more value by following this 80/20 process. So at first, you might need to have a little bit of faith in the process. It can feel like you're going to be missing things, and in fact, you probably are missing things. But what you need to get better at and better at is knowing that the things that you are missing are in the 80% that is not nearly as important as the 20% that is very important. So this is my process for 80/20 while learning in a nutshell. First, you should understand the outcome that you want, as we've talked about before. You can't 80/20 the information if you don't know what you're trying to learn. After that, you should read or listen to or watch the first section. It might be a chapter of a book, it might be a paragraph, or the opening of an article. You need to read the first section first. Then I skip directly to the conclusion, the chapter, the summary, or the closing statements. A quick side note that I didn't talk about here is if I don't feel like the conclusion brings me close to the outcome that I wanted, I simply won't read that piece of information. I'll go and look for something else. I make a mental note of the things that are in the middle that I don't understand. How did they get from point A to point B? Is point B, first of all, where I want to be? And how did they get there from the opening that we talked about already? Make note of these things that you feel like you might not understand or might need a little bit more clarification or explanation for you. After these notes that you've made in your mind, you should feel comfortable deciding what to take in, what chapters, which paragraphs, or which sections might be important and what to skip over. That's really the process that I use for 80/20 before I get into the book. I also tend to use speed reading techniques that are more technical than this course really has the time to explain. But of course, there are a few that you can use right off the bat. Try reading only the first sentence of every paragraph and only slowing down once you get lost. That's one of my favorite techniques. Try reading only the opening and closing paragraphs of each chapter. Try listening to things on 2 or 3 times speed and only slowing down when you get lost or something is important. All of these things are not only going to cut the learning time you spend reading, listening, and learning by a lot, but they'll also require that you stay laser focused, which is what we're going to talk about in the very next lesson. We're going to talk about how to focus, why focus is so important, and how focus is going to help you with your learning and mind mapping process. Welcome back to our second lesson inside of the mind mapping principles unit in the course. We're going to talk about focus inside of this unit. We're going to talk about the power of focus and a few of the different focusing techniques that I use while I'm mind mapping and while I'm reading. One of the more meta things that learning is good for is actually really honing in on two powerful different skills. Skill number one is, of course, that ability to parse or 80/20 the information, meaning that you're going to have the ability to learn new things quicker. Skill number two is the ability to focus and think deeply about a particular topic. This skill requires honing in, especially in today's day and age, as we're getting more and more distracted and we're having more and more difficulty focusing. I think mind mapping allows us to really work on both of these two different skills. When we need to read something or listen to something without the need to produce a summary of it, we end up just taking in all the information. I'm sure probably a lot of us have listened to a full podcast, listened to a full book, and not even thought about what might be important for us to take away from that piece of information. When we mind map, it gives us a chance to be creative, dip into flow states, and really double down on our practice of focus. So, mind mapping is very good at helping us build these two skills that are so important. This ability to 80/20 information, which as information is getting more and more prevalent and available, we need this more than ever. Skill number two, which is focus, which is probably the number one skill that's going to be needed in the workforce and entrepreneurship in the future, is the ability not to get distracted and to be able to focus on things until completion. That's what we're going to be learning about here today. Below are some of the techniques that I use to work on my focus. These techniques work well for me, but you may have to find different things that are going to work well for you. I'm not saying that my brain is going to be the exact same as your brain. Just like we all have different learning styles, we all have different focus styles as well. So it's very important to find what works for you, not only in mind mapping and taking in information, but in how you focus. But here's a couple of them that work well for me. Number one is for taking in information. When taking in information, I want to make sure that I stay stimulated. The speed reading techniques that we talked about before actually increase your level of focus. Quite often people will think it happens as the opposite, where if you speed read, you didn't really learn as much as you would have if you took your time. But it actually increases our need to focus, so we don't zone out while we're reading. Because as soon as you stop focusing, you're going to get lost in the information. So this is actually providing a really great feedback loop for our learning and our focus. Most of the time, when I take in information, I need silence. I'm the type of person that there can't be anything going on in the background. This provides a great environment for my mind to stay focused on the information at hand. When we have music or outside noise playing, the brain has to kind of sort through another layer of what might be important. Now, I've heard of some people saying that they need music on in order to learn, and hey, that's okay. I'm just telling you what works well for me. Taking information is not just the act of reading. It's listening. It's not just the act of reading, listening, or watching. It's the act of actually processing the information. Because of this, I like to read in small chunks and take fairly large breaks between to do something almost entirely different. So it's not just about taking in all the information. It's not about listening to the full interview, not about reading the whole book. It's not about that. What it is about your ability to process the information. So one really good way that I use is I'll read for 20 minutes and then I'll take a 10-minute break. This is called the Pomodoro technique. I'll stretch during that time, I'll talk to someone, or I'll just sit in silence. The information I read sticks much, much better this way, and I recommend that you test it out. We're not all able to focus for very, very long periods of time, but even if you read for an hour a day by doing this sequence, you'll be able to get 40 minutes worth of reading in that will be worth much more than an hour worth of straight reading because it allows your brain to relax and process the information during those 10-minute breaks. I recommend that you test this out not only just for reading, but for all other sorts of information taking in, and even for work itself. I really like to use the Pomodoro technique when I'm working too. Next, let's talk about creating mind maps. When we're thinking about problems, we're thinking through problems, and we're creating something new, we want to get into what they call a flow state. Mind maps are amazing at helping with this. First of all, XMind has this amazing capability of going into Zen mode, which is going to shut off all of your external distraction, which is step number one to get into flow. Second, the mind mapping process has this amazing ability to stimulate this stream of conscious writing. You never have to take a break and you can just produce and produce and produce, unlike writing into a Word document, which sometimes you'll have to erase and the information doesn't quite line up. With mind mapping, you can just spit out all of the information, and then later on, when you're going back through and editing it, you can actually process that information. Third, and perhaps the most important, you always have a gauge of how much you're producing. Something important for creating flow states is to feel as though you're actually making progress. And as you're kind of expanding your mind mapping and expanding the child nodes and making more pieces of information line up in mind mapping, this really starts to stimulate the flow state simply because you know that you're making progress, which sometimes when you're taking notes can be difficult to feel. The flow states can take a few minutes to get into. Therefore, I don't actually think that it's very smart to do the 20-10 Pomodoro split that we talked about before while you're mind mapping. If you're taking in the information, it's actually very, very good to be doing 20-10 because our brains can't focus for a massive amount of time, at least mine can't. But while I'm in the flow state, I don't want to take a break from the flow state because it can take a few minutes to get into. Instead, I think it's much more effective to work something like a 40 minutes on and 20 minutes off. Allows us to get that first maybe 5 to 10 minutes, which is going to be a little bit tough to get into the flow state, but it gives us a 30 minutes worth of flow state. And I've read in different places that someone who is in a flow state versus someone who is not in a flow state is going to produce at a 5 times faster rate. So that 30 minutes is actually going to add up to quite a lot of time. It's actually going to add up to a lot of time you've been able to produce simply because you've been able to be 5 times more effective because you've set up this environment to get you into the flow state. Another point here is don't edit in your first time, in your first round. This is one thing that I've definitely learned the hard way. When we edit on the first pass, we turn our internal critic on, which really breaks our process and completely knocks us out of flow state. Instead, I recommend you leave all the spelling errors or sentences that you don't actually make sense in the map until you decide to go back and edit it. When you're in the flow state, let the information flow out of you, even if it's spelt wrong or doesn't make sense all the way through. Fix that up in the editing. Music actually is helpful to get into the flow state. So while I'm processing information, while I'm taking in information, I don't like to listen to music. But while I'm processing the information, while I'm creating something, music is actually very helpful to get us into the flow state. This might be more of a personal preference, but I find a nice piece of relaxing music really makes it easier to turn off that internal editor that I have. Pick something either without lyrics or lyrics that you know off by heart so you don't get distracted. But when you're actually mind mapping, music is a really great tool to help facilitate that flow state. Those were the focusing techniques that we're working on, and those are the few that I think that you should work on, not only just with mind mapping, but also in your daily life. Are you taking in new information? Try to do it in silence. Try to do it in short bursts. Are you creating something? Try to do it in a longer burst so you can get through that first 5 to 10 minutes that's quite difficult, and put some music on that's rhythmic and going to help you produce something at a quicker rate. I bet you'll see your productivity absolutely skyrocket, and you'll be able to learn more and remember better from the information that you take in. Next, we're going to move into the format learning model, which is one of the most heavily information packed pieces of content in the entire course. Looking forward to it. Welcome to the third unit inside of our principles module, where we're going to be talking about the format learning model, the learning model that I use in each and every one of my mind maps. First, we'll start with an overview of what the format learning model really is. It was developed to help us think through information in a more dynamic and engaging way. The model contains 4 different learning quadrants that are listed here below that we'll talk about in a minute. They all relate to one learning style in particular. Each person likely has one primary learning style. Some people know what theirs is and some don't, but most of the information is put forth in the what learning style. So books, interviews, and videos, all that sort of thing. Most of the time, people are giving you the what of the information part, which is simply just a theoretical breakdown of what they're talking about. But by identifying our main learning style, as well as filtering information through all 4 different learning styles, we can dramatically increase our learning ability. So you can see here in this diagram that the 4 main learning styles are what, which is the main concepts or the theoretical breakdown. The how is the skills or how this would actually work in place in your life. The if, this is where else would this apply? Adaptations of the information. And why is the meaning or why it might be important to you. So the format learning model, let's talk about all of the different places that you might use it, some of the questions that you might ask of the information that you're taking in. So why essentially is the question of why do I need to learn this? This might be your learning style if you find yourself constantly wondering how does this apply, or if you get bored by information quickly. These people care more about what the information means to them than what the information is. Why learners tend to have trouble getting started on topics that don't excite them. Now, this probably is a lot of you. And what I find, and what I found in school, was that there was almost no reason why. The why was often because I told you so, or because this is in the curriculum. That's why you need to learn it. And that can make it quite hard to learn any information. But now that we have the ability to determine our whys and only take in information that aligns with our personal whys, now we can learn from information in a way that is much deeper and more exciting to almost everyone. So let's talk about mind mapping why. You can improve your ability to 80/20. That's why we would want to do mind mapping. Your improved ability to focus is why you would want to mind map. Improving your critical thinking skills is another reason why you might want to use mind mapping. So you can see I've used the why learning model to explain why mind mapping is important. The next model is the what. So what is the theoretical breakdown of the concepts? This might be you if you're the type of person who likes to learn simply for learning's sake. These people are often quoting books or articles and seem to have an amazing memory for information. What learners tend to have trouble with implementing the information into relevant concepts, principles, and actions. And if that's you, then you're going to really want to focus on not only just the what learning style, but also how can you adapt it? How can you use the how learning style and the what if learning style to kind of supercharge this amazing ability that you might have as a what learner to remember and kind of memorize information. So let's talk about the what of mind mapping. Well, the technical aspects of mind mapping, some of the units that we've talked about before, might be the what aspects of mind mapping. Structure of the information might be the what of mind mapping. You kind of see how everything is broken down into its component parts and then actually adds up to the larger kind of parent nodes or the larger main topics that you're talking about. So that's why mind mapping is so good for the what learners, is because it allows you to see the structure of the information and can aid in that ability to memorize and quote information that the what learners like to do so much. Let's talk about the how learners. How might the information apply to your life? This might be you if you're skipping to the parts of the information that contain the how to or the strategies. These people are often trying new techniques or tricks they learned from somewhere else. How learners tend to have trouble because they skip from technique to technique without understanding the why or the what part of the actual learning that they're doing. So, quite often with how people, they'll try technique, 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 but they never will think about the what. They won't think about the why this technique is important, and they won't think about the what as in what is the full picture of this technique? Why might this technique work for me, and where could I use this technique? They don't think about those things, so they tend to skip from technique to technique to technique. So they have this superpower of going from information to implementation very quickly, but they also get held back because they don't think all the way through the problems all the time. Let's talk about the how of mind mapping. Well, you start by speed reading a piece of information, you break it down into the subtopics, and then you expand on the subtopics using the format model. So you can see that a lot of this course is actually geared towards the how learners, because how learners are the people who are usually going to be taking courses. And in fact, I find myself to be quite a how learner myself, trying new things quite a lot. And if I'm not careful, I don't always think through the what and the why of the problems that I'm trying to solve. I just go right into the strategies. Next, we're going to talk about the what if. So where else could this information apply? This might be you if you're an innovator or an entrepreneur who sees solutions to problems that others don't. Maybe you're pulling from information that you read in a book or did on another project, and you pull it into the new project that you're working on. These people are often working on projects and relating the new information that they learned to that project. So not even necessarily new information. These people are very, very good at pulling information from the depths that they've read, listened to, or learned before and using it in new and innovative solutions. What if learners tend to suffer from the same problems as why and how learners? They don't quite understand the full depth of the information, and quite often they can move again from topic to technique without actually understanding taking the time to understand the full breadth of the information and the problem at hand. So let's talk about some of the mind mapping what if. What might be an example of some mapping what ifs? Well, you could apply mind mapping to goal setting. You could apply to creative pursuits. You could use mind mapping to just structure information, even though you're not necessarily trying to learn. So you might be able to use mind mapping to adapt in many, many different ways. And that would be the what if, or where else could this information be useful for me of mind mapping. Next, we'll talk about the format and mind mapping. So first with the main topic, how we would use format to choose our main topic. Choosing our main topic, whether it be a book or an article, should always be done using the format model. The format model for choosing information might look something like this. Why is this piece of information important to me? What am I trying to learn from this information? How will this information apply to my life right now? And where else might this information be relevant to me? So you can see that before you choose the piece of information, whatever it might be, a book, an article, a video, you want to have these things in mind. And by having these things in mind, these pieces are going to stick out to you along your way of learning, and then you can turn it into a mind map as you go. The subtopics. Let's talk about when creating our subtopics, we should keep the format model in mind as well. So what might the format model for creating subtopics look like? Why did this topic stick out? There might be dozens and dozens of potential topics in the book that I've read. Why did this one stick out to me the most? What theoretical information was helpful around this topic? Maybe what were the things that I didn't know or didn't understand about the topic before reading the book? Will this topic relate directly to my life or a project or a problem that I'm working on? And how might it relate to this product or to this product or project that I'm working on? Was this topic a principle or a strategy? This is something a little bit more in depth, but essentially the way that I think about it is a strategy would be good for one thing at one time. It might be a how-to list of how to, Get your finances figured out. That's a strategy, something that will work well for one thing. But a principle is something that you could apply to many different areas of your life. And whenever we're learning, we want to be focusing as much time on principles as we possibly can, because this is going to allow us to maximize the use of the information that we're learning. So you're always looking for, if you're learning anything, what are the principles of this more so than the strategies? Now, this doesn't mean that strategies are completely unimportant, but what it does mean is that we should spend more of our time, more of our energy on the principles rather than on the strategies. Let's talk about formatting the copied information. Well, when we're creating our subtopics or our copied information, we need to keep that format model in mind. Can I clearly see why this information is important to me? Can I clearly see why this copied information is important? Why might this information be important? Why did I copy this particular piece of information? Does this excerpt, capture the theoretical information? In other words, do I know everything that I theoretically need to know about the problem from this highlighted point or from this copied down point from an interview? Does this information give me a process? And if it doesn't give me a process, can I make a process up from this information? Does this information apply directly to more than one area? Have I chosen to copy a piece of information that can be used in more than just the reason why I started reading the information in the first place? Next, we'll talk about the format model and our own kind of created information underneath the copied information. Well, when creating our format or our written down pieces of information, we need to think about, why is this important to me or to someone else? So once you have it copied down, you want to write down in your subtopics, or you want to write down in the self-created topics, why is this information important to me or to someone else? What does the author tell us about the information? What are some of the theoretical points that stuck out to me the most? Can I create a simple process to follow? Or if there is already a process, you could just leave it that way. Alternatively, can I see how this is already at play in my life? Now, this is a question that I sometimes like to use, where if I can't create a process necessarily, and sometimes it's not worth it to create a process, can I already see the process or the principle at play in my life? Sometimes this is a good reflective question and helps us see where things are already at play in our life and helps us remember much, much better. Where else can this information be used? Alternatively, where else is this information already at play in my own life? So can I see where this information, where this principle, where this theory is already at play in my own life? And by connecting it back to our own lives, rather than trying to project it out into the future, is very, very helpful for not only just remembering the information, but being able to actually activate and use the information in our daily lives. So that's the format learning model. If it was a little deep and a little complex, I apologize. You'll definitely see how the format learning model comes into play during our exercise section of the mind mapping course. But for now, we're going to move on to presenting. Welcome back to the 4th unit inside of our principles module of the mind mapping course. In this unit, we're going to be talking about presenting and why it's so important to at least pretend that you're presenting the information to someone else while creating your mind map. While I'm in the flow of writing a mind map, I try not to self-censor. And we talked about this before. That it's best not to censor while you're in flow. You don't want to create that internal critic if you can help it. The process of writing is definitely hard enough without having that critic looking over your shoulder. So to get the most out of mind mapping, again, do not edit while you're writing. Instead, you want to wait until after you're finished the mind map, or at the very least, a section of the mind map. But the editing process is very important, and this is actually how I like to go about editing. While I'm editing, I read through the mind map either in my head or out loud. Instead of thinking, is this right or is this important, I think of someone in particular I would like to present the information to. And quite often for me, it's you guys. It's everyone that has ever asked me a question or in my coaching calls has expressed an interest. I try and present the mind map in my head while I'm editing to you. Most often, again, it's that audience of the YouTube channel. But before I did the YouTube channel, it might have been my brother, my parents, or my girlfriend, as if I was explaining it to them. One great person to keep in mind is either your past or your future self as well. That's getting a little bit deeper into it, but how could you teach yourself, your past self, the way that you've acted in the past about some of these principles that you're learning from the book? Or what might this book say to your future self, the better person, the person that has been working on self development for 5, 10, or 20 years? It's a good perspective shift. And that perspective shift just gives you enough of a perspective shift in order to help you cement the information in a different way. It forces your brain to articulate the points in a way that's easy to remember, but also articulated in a way that's going to be easy to implement, which again is one of the big things that we're trying to do here with mind mapping. Then, while I'm going through my map, instead of saying, "Is this grammar right? Is this exactly what the author had in mind?" I say, "Would this make sense to them?" Using the format model allows us to think all the way through the information. But one of its other uses is actually as an amazing presentation tool. Remember, we have these 4 different models of learning, and if you're presenting it not only to yourself, but if you're presenting it to a group of people, you need to hit every single one of these learning styles, or else you're going to leave one of them out. So if you're going through your map and you feel like someone might not understand it because you didn't fully cover one of the quadrants, so make sure that you go back and you fully cover the why, the what, the how, and the what if, and then you'll be able to easily present it in a way that's going to be memorable and actionable for the people that you might be presenting it to, or even to your future self. Once you've identified that quadrant, simply spend some time expanding on that particular aspect. So I believe that this is actually meant to be up a little bit farther. And what we should be talking about here is a person in your life or yourself. You want to present the information in that learning style. So if you were presenting it to yourself and you're much of a how learner, you want to make sure that you're presenting it in a very how based way. You want to make sure that you have the step by step. You want to make sure that you have the how to part of it. And vice versa, if you're a what learner, you might spend a little bit more time on the information. If you're a why learner, you might spend a little bit more time on that. Keep your audience that you've decided to present to in mind while you're presenting. And while you're doing that, you can expand on their particular mode of learning the most. If you don't know the person's mode of learning, do a little bit of an inventory. Ask them about themselves, talk to them about themselves, and learn how they learn. If you can identify how other people learn, it's going to help you identify how you can learn as well. So creating a mind map so that you can present it it doesn't mean that you have to present it, although it definitely is helpful. And I believe that it's very good to present this information, especially if you could put it up on YouTube. I would love to see a lot of other mind mappers out there presenting information in the way that they learn the best. I think that we have this wonderful tool of YouTube for everyone to be able to share their information, and some people will resonate with other people a little bit more. The more, the merrier. Let's say you're trying to convince someone, help someone, or share information. How much better might you get at it if you're practicing it in your head over and over again when you got new information? So this is very interesting because I believe that this skill of persuasion and coaching and communication are some of the most valuable skills in today's society. In fact, I saw a study on LinkedIn the other day that said that communication skills are the number 1 sought after skill of all companies across the board. These are the exact skills that we're going to be building while we're present editing, while we're creating a mind map, while we're thinking all the way through our format learning model, and while we're presenting, we are learning these amazing skills of presentation. But the presentation also helps you because in order to present something, you must actually know the thing. Einstein said that if you don't know the topic well enough to explain it to a 5-year-old, well, you don't know it well enough. Teaching is the best way to learn something new because it provides real-time feedback, meaning if you don't know something well enough, you will be easily able to identify it. If you can't fully articulate and present the piece of information, then you have identified that you don't know the information well enough. That's another one of the great aspects of presenting. Aside from developing these great skills, aside from doubling down on all of these different learning styles that we're trying to use to increase our memory and remember better and learn more, it also is giving us this amazing ability to identify what we don't know well enough so that we can go back and maybe learn a little bit more. And that's it for the principles of mind mapping. We're moving on to the exercises, which I know is the unit that a lot of you have probably been looking forward to.